Heat of the moment radio messages are always good value for hearing what a Formula 1 driver really thinks, especially when they're ticked off. Charles Leclerc's no stranger to getting irate over the radio, but in the Azerbaijan Grand Prix he wasn't reacting to being stitched up by the stewards or making a mistake. Leclerc was shocked by the delayed deployment of the safety car after Max Verstappen's tyre failure and subsequent heavy crash, and his cry that it was a joke turned the spotlight on the officials. The Ferrari drivers had his say and we're going to have ours here, so make sure you share your take in the comments below, because this wasn't the only incident from the Baku race that raised concerns, and it is part of a wider, slightly worrying picture. The safety car call was the headline head-scratching moment from the officials in Baku. After Verstappen hit the wall heavily at high speed, racing continued for almost a full lap afterwards. Leclerc was told they were still racing after passing Verstappen's crashed car and replied, "That's a joke, that's a joke. Put the f***ing safety car out straight away, why are they waiting?" He wasn't the only one to air his confusion. George Russell asked, "Where's the bloody safety car?" He didn't get an answer because it was still about half a lap away. Though it took just a short while for double-waved yellows to be issued, almost a minute and a half passed between Verstappen's crash and the safety car being deployed. In that time, new race leader Sergio Perez had already made his way round to the start-finish straight again. It's baffling that drivers like Leclerc and Russell recognise the obvious need for an instant safety car, but race director Michael Masi opted to wait so long. Sticking with double-waved yellows would have made sense if there was a hope of the marshals recovering the car quickly on their own, but it was immediately obvious that the recovery wasn't going to be possible without the help of recovery vehicles. Leclerc said he was surprised the safety car hadn't been called sooner and wanted to raise his concern immediately, hence his irritated radio message. He's one of a few drivers who have said they will raise this issue at the next drivers' briefing in France, and they should, because it merits explanation. There seems no justification for such a delay. All it did was leave drivers approaching a dangerous high-speed area with debris scattered across the track and hold up the recovery process. The reaction to Lance Stroll's similar incident earlier in the race was sharper, but that was another inevitable obvious safety car that still took nearly half a minute to deploy, by which time multiple cars had passed the scene. Hesitation in both instances also played a part in another point of contention from the race, which was whether the drivers reacted appropriately to double-waved yellows. Yellow flag etiquette is always a thorny issue in F1. Double-waved yellows require a driver to slow significantly and be prepared to stop. The safety of trackside workers is a key priority, and it also protects drivers who may still be in their stricken cars or getting out of them. We all know that drivers never slow down to a speed that means they are prepared to stop, because they all take liberties to avoid losing a competitive edge. Really, the terminology is outdated, unrealistic and potentially unsafe, especially at a high-speed part of the track. It relies entirely on individual interpretation of what slowing down sufficiently actually means. For a driver, that's a small lift, but for the officials it's often more. Technology has moved beyond such limitations, and virtual and full safety cars force a driver to adhere to a delta time. In Formula E, it's common to see a full course yellow initiated before being escalated to a full safety car if necessary. That eliminates any interpretation and takes the decision making away from competitive individuals in the heat of battle who don't want to give up any time if they can help it. The issue in Baku was brought into focus by the new for 2021 broadcast of exchanges between the teams and Masi. It emerged that McLaren had raised a concern over AlphaTauri driver Yuki Tsunoda's response to the yellow flags shown for both Verstappen's accident and also Stroll's. Masi's contention was that in his opinion every driver had broken the rules and not slowed down enough, so singling out Tsunoda wasn't of interest to him, and he said he'd raise it with every driver at the next meeting. The basis of that premise is fine, because establishing good driver etiquette under yellow flags is very important. So it's a problem worth tackling, but this wasn't the way to tackle it. First of all, Masi's claim doesn't really hold up. Lando Norris's replay shows a clear big lift in response to the Verstappen accident, and there's little hint of the same from Tsunoda. Much further back, Mick Schumacher absolutely crawled past the crashed Red Bull. We checked how different drivers reacted to the yellows for Stroll's crash car as well, and found a similar story, with no audible indication of a Tsunoda lift, but clear backing off from the likes of Norris and Valtteri Bottas. Because this comes down to individual interpretation, Masi could still argue that every driver broke the rules to some extent. But that doesn't really track because the only thing Schumacher could have done more in response to the yellow flags would have been to stop. In any case, it's baseless to suggest every driver reacted by only lifting a little bit. And on reviewing Tsunoda's onboard footage, all we can say is he was very lucky to escape punishment. But the second key point in this is that it's simply surprising the race director can have the suspicion that every driver broke the rules and not think it merits further investigation. If the view is that every driver was in the wrong, the answer isn't to let them all off, especially when the offences occurred at a section of track where speeds approach 200 miles per hour. That doesn't mean giving every driver a 5-second penalty and creating loads of paperwork for something that wouldn't make a difference to the end result. But if every driver had been investigated and were deemed to have breached the yellow flag rules, they'd be hit with licence penalty points. And that adds up because it punishes repeat offenders. It's exactly what the super licence penalty system is there for, and a driver who breaches the rules shouldn't get away with it just because others are also being unsafe. Issues with officiating go back well beyond Massey's time as race director. It's not like everybody always saw eye to eye with the FIA in the late Charlie Whiting's era either. But it's fair to say there have been high-profile cases of concern since Massey stepped into that role. The massive crash at a restart in last year's Mugello race is a good case study. 4 cars were eliminated from the Tuscan Grand Prix as a combination of factors created a concertina effect that dramatically caught out drivers at the tail end of the midfield. 12 drivers received warnings for their perceived roles in creating the circumstances for that accident, but several drivers also felt the FIA had played a part. They argued that before the restart the safety car lights had been turned off later than normal. That's the sign for the race leader, in this case Valtteri Bottas, to take control of the restart speed. By only letting him do that so close to the start of the ultra-long Mugello straight, it effectively forced him to wait as long as possible before accelerating, and that contributed to the chaos. Massey denied the lights were turned off any later than normal, but we checked it at the time and the safety car lights did go out closer to the control line than at previous races. The saga even prompted the Grand Prix Drivers Association, which represents every F1 driver, to write to Massey and the FIA in the aftermath. They were also prompted to follow up a concern after the inexplicable decision taken in Turkish Grand Prix qualifying to start the second segment with a recovery vehicle still in use. Q2 at Istanbul started when the recovery of Nicholas Latifi's Williams hadn't been completed and double-waved yellows were deployed at turn 8 for the drivers' outlaps as the recovery vehicle was still in use and marshals were present in the runoff area. Massey had been told by the clerk of the course the track should be clear in time, and that process was unexpectedly delayed after Massey opted to start Q2 on the assumption it would be fine. But no explanation was given for why the session wasn't just delayed for a short amount of time to reduce that risk to zero. As we said, double-waved yellows were deployed as an emergency measure, but it was questionable to think that was sufficient in the wet conditions of qualifying, especially as track grip had been so poor all weekend that people had been going off on outlaps. The policing of yellow flags had also been called into question just 2 weeks earlier at Imola. Lance Stroll was trying to catch up to a safety car queue during the race, missed the yellow flags, and arrived pretty much full speed on a scene where marshals were working trackside. One marshal was even still on the track, sweeping away debris, but the incident wasn't even investigated. There have also been non-safety issues as well, particularly with the policing of track limits and inconsistencies in how some penalties are applied. But while these are frustrating, they pale in comparison to real safety issues. Officiating is rarely transparent in any sport. Often the justification for certain decisions is very defensive, and we rarely hear an admission that the officials have handled something incorrectly or could have done a better job. That would imply the process is perfect. But there are plenty of examples of questionable decision making that tells us that's simply not the case. But what do you think? Are we being too harsh on F1's officials, or do questions need to be asked? Make sure you have your say in the comments, hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe if you haven't already to join us again for more in the future.